When the Eisenhower administration began, it was largely being accepted that the containment policy had failed. They cited the territories lost in the Far East and assumed that the United States was going to have to fight to free all of the lost countries. The issue with that philosophy was the Soviet Union was still maintaining a 3 million man standing army. The United States estimated that if the Soviets hit them with a surprise attack, NATO would suffer 12 million casualties. To minimize that possibility, the Americans attempted to maintain a conventional counter to deter the Soviets from such a surprise. So Eisenhower created a foreign policy he dubbed the New Look. This would rely upon strategic air power and nuclear bombs to deter. Eisenhower believed it was a cheaper alternative. He argued, quote, "If we let defensive spending run wild, you get inflation, then controls, then a garrison state, and then we've lost the very values we're trying to defend," end quote. He called it brinksmanship. The U.S. wouldn't back down even if it meant going to the brink of war. It became American policy to threaten the Soviets anywhere in the world. They would have an opportunity in Vietnam. At the end of the war, France expressed a belief that it needed to maintain its global empire to remain a global power. After World War II, it resumed its effort to occupy Southeast Asia. The problems for this were many, but especially that Vietnam had been trying to get its freedom from foreign occupiers for more than 1,000 years. There was also a dynamic leader in Ho Chi Minh that had won the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese and had them believing that independence was a possibility. The problem for the West was in Ho's communism and communist backing from Moscow and Beijing. The French were not able to maintain their hold on the country, and much like had happened in Korea, the country was partitioned between a communist North and a Western-supported South. China continued to pose international problems as well. Following Stalin's death, the Chinese communists had not been impressed by his successor Nikita Khrushchev's willingness to negotiate. China was willing to become a more vocal international player and was trying to use Korea to flex its muscles against both the United States and Soviet Union. Eisenhower almost immediately began playing hardball with the Chinese. He ordered the fleet that had been separating the Chinese nationalists in Taiwan from the mainland over to Korea to try to influence an armistice. No longer was the United States going to prevent an invasion of mainland China. Without the fleet to protect Taiwan, though, Eisenhower also began upping its investment in Taiwan to $250 million annually. After the Korean conflict, the fleet returned as the U.S. insisted that it had to keep Taiwan safe from the communists. The relationship with China became so tense that when the two sides engaged in the Geneva Conventions to negotiate French removal from Vietnam, the Americans and Chinese barely spoke. In 1954, the Chinese began an international Liberate Taiwan campaign. Their method of liberation was similar to the Soviets in that they started it militaristically by shelling islands about 100 miles from Taiwan. Ike responded by asking Congress to up the military presence to defend Taiwan and was given a blank check for the region. As it was believed Mao was practicing brinkmanship of his own by shelling the island so close to Taiwan, Eisenhower warned him that he would use nuclear bombs, quote, "just exactly as you would use a bullet or anything else," end quote. As the situation in Asia seemed to deteriorate, the relationship with the Soviets improved. Truman had not been willing to negotiate with the Soviets, so when Stalin died, Eisenhower surprised them by opening the door to negotiate with Khrushchev. Much of that was based on his ironically expressed discomfort with militarism. He said that, quote, "every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed," end quote. As both the Americans and Soviets had thermonuclear weapons and were developing intercontinental ballistic missiles to better utilize them, it seemed as if it was in everyone's best interest to minimize the risk that they'd start lobbing them at each other. The Americans also started using espionage to try to minimize that possibility. The Central Intelligence Agency was born of the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, during World War II. They would most loudly make their presence felt in Iran and Guatemala. In Iran, the country had an established democracy, but when British petroleum was nationalized, the concern became that the Iranian government would begin selling energy to the Soviets. In Guatemala, concern had arisen out of a left-leaning government that had nationalized 234,000 acres that were owned by an American fruit company. The CIA was sent in under an understanding that the Cold War had no rules. It was being more openly determined that long-standing American concepts of fair play must be reconsidered. With that in mind, the CIA was empowered to subvert, sabotage, and destroy American enemies.